My mom said she was protecting me. Then I found out she was the one selling me out. I spent 27 years thinking my mother was my shield against a cruel world, only to discover she was the one selling the arrows to shoot me down. Hey everyone, before we get in the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Rowan, and I am 27 years old. For as long as I could remember, my world was defined by a singular, dramatic fracture, the day my father left. He didn't just leave the marriage. He left the state, effectively vanishing from our lives and leaving behind a mountain of debt and a heartbroken wife. In the chaotic years that followed, my mother, Brenda, transformed before my eyes. She went from being a quiet, submissive housewife to a towering figure of resilience. She worked 2, sometimes 3, jobs to keep a roof over our heads. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor, constantly reminding me that while the world might be full of people who would abandon us, we had each other. We were a fortress of 2. She was the gatekeeper, and I was the precious charge she swore to protect from the cruelty of outsiders. Growing up, this dynamic cemented itself into the bedrock of my personality. I was a sensitive child, prone to anxiety and easily overwhelmed by the chaotic energy of the world outside our apartment. Whenever I struggled, whether it was with school bullies or my own crushing perfectionism, my mother was there to soothe me. She would stroke my hair and tell me that the rest of the world just didn't understand us. She painted our relatives, her aunts, cousins, and siblings, as judgmental and shallow people who didn't understand the depth of our bond. She told me they were jealous of how close we were and that they would use any sign of weakness to tear me down. Because of this, I learned to keep my guard up. I stopped sharing my feelings with anyone but her. She became my confidant, my therapist, and my best friend all rolled into one. As I entered my 20s, the pressure of adulthood began to bear down on me. I had moved out briefly for college, but had to move back home after a severe depressive episode tanked my grades and my mental health. I felt like a failure, returning to the nest with my tail between my legs. But my mother didn't treat me like a failure. She welcomed me with open arms, telling me that the world was too hard for sensitive souls like mine and that it was perfectly okay to regroup. She set up a room for me, cooked my meals, and listened endlessly to my spiraling thoughts about how useless I felt. She seemed to thrive on my dependence. The more I fell apart, the more she put herself back together, acting as the glue that held my shattered psyche in place. I trusted her implicitly. I believed that her love was the only pure thing in a life filled with rejection and instability. I didn't know then that her nurturing was actually a cage, and that every secret I whispered in the dark was being cataloged for a price I would soon discover. The first crack in the veneer of my reality appeared during a routine family gathering. My mother's sister, my Aunt Vera, had invited us over for a Sunday dinner. It was a rare occurrence, as my mother usually claimed that family obligations were too stressful for her fragile health, a condition that seemed to flare up whenever she was expected to be social. However, this time, Brenda insisted we go. She spent hours getting me ready, picking out my clothes, and telling me to just be myself, though she emphasized how important it was to appear stable, so they wouldn't have ammunition against us. I took her words to heart, nervous about facing the cousins I hadn't seen in years. The evening started off pleasantly enough, but I quickly began to notice an undercurrent of tension. Whenever I walked into a room, conversations would halt abruptly. My cousin, usually a boisterous and funny guy, looked at me with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and fear. I tried to engage him in conversation about my job search, a topic that caused me immense anxiety, but he cut me off quickly, glancing over his shoulder at my mother, as if checking for permission. It was bewildering. I felt like an alien in a room full of people who knew something I didn't. Every time I spoke about my hopes or my fears, I was met with strange, knowing nods, as if they were humoring a delusional child. By the time we reached dessert, the atmosphere was stifling. I excused myself to the bathroom to catch my breath, feeling the walls closing in. As I stood at the sink, splashing cold water on my face, I heard voices in the hallway. It was Aunt Vera and my mother. Their voices were hushed but urgent. I froze, the water dripping off my chin, listening through the thin wooden door. Aunt Vera was pleading, saying that they couldn't keep doing this, that it was destroying the family. My mother's voice was sharp and cold, a tone I had never heard directed at anyone but my father. She told Vera that she didn't have a right to judge, that she was doing what was necessary to survive, and that if the help stopped, the consequences would be on Vera's head. I didn't understand the context, but the venom in my mother's voice sent a chill down my spine. When I emerged, my mother was the picture of calm again, looping her arm through mine and steering me toward the door, whispering that we had to leave immediately because the toxic energy was bad for my condition. I drove home in silence, staring out the window, wondering what my condition actually was and why everyone seemed to know its definition except for me. In the months that followed that dinner, the distance between my perception and reality began to widen. I finally secured a job interview at a marketing firm in the city. It was a big break for me, the first real opportunity one had had in a long time. I was terrified, plagued by imposter syndrome and insomnia. In the days leading up to the interview, I relied heavily on my mother for reassurance. I spent nights sitting in the living room, pouring out my deepest insecurities, telling her that I felt like I was on the verge of a breakdown, that I was worried I wasn't mentally strong enough to hold down a job. She listened, stroking my back, offering me tea, and telling me that I was brave just for trying. The interview itself went well, or so I thought. I left the building feeling a tentative spark of hope. But that hope was extinguished 3 days later when I received a generic rejection email. No reason was given, just a curt notification that they had moved forward with other candidates. I was devastated, sinking into a depression that felt heavier than usual. My mother was there to catch me, as always. She told me that corporate America was ruthless and that they probably sensed my artistic soul and felt threatened by it. She encouraged me to take some time to heal, suggesting I focus on helping her around the house instead of throwing myself back into the meat grinder of the job market. What I didn't know then was that my rejection wasn't random. It would be almost a year before I found out the truth, but the mechanism of my failure was already in motion. Unbeknownst to me, the company was owned by a second cousin of my father, a distant connection I didn't even know existed. But my mother knew. In fact, she had spent years cultivating a network of distant relatives and acquaintances, weaving a complex web of connections based entirely on her role as the long-suffering mother of a mentally unstable child. My breakdowns were not just struggles to her. They were currency. Every panic attack I had was documented in detail in her narratives to others. She had reached out to my father's cousin before my interview, not to put in a good word, but to warn him. She had told him and others that I was prone to violent outbursts, that I was delusional, and that hiring me would be a liability risk. She painted me as a ticking time bomb, all while comforting me at home, telling me that the world was cruel for not seeing my worth. The rejection was a result of her sabotage, a necessary sacrifice to ensure that I remained dependent on her, and by extension, that she remained the victim in the eyes of her audience. The truth came out on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the most mundane way possible. My mother had asked me to fix a glitch on her laptop. She claimed her email wasn't syncing properly on her tablet, and since I was the tech-savvy one in the house, she handed it over to me while she went to the grocery store. I sat at the kitchen table, logging into her account. The problem was simple enough, just a settings error, but as I waited for the system to reboot, a notification popped up on the screen. It was a new email in her inbox from a woman named Mrs. Higgins, a wealthy widow from our old church who had cut off contact with us years ago. The subject line read, monthly support for Rowan's care. Curiosity, fueled by years of subtle inconsistencies, got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't look. It was an invasion of privacy. But the phrase Rowan's care struck a chord of confusion. I wasn't receiving any professional care. I opened the email. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the words. Mrs. Higgins was apologizing for the delay in sending a check of $500. She wrote that she understood how expensive my medications were and how difficult it was to manage my episodes without proper insurance. She thanked my mother for being a saint and for keeping the family informed of my deteriorating condition so they could pray for me. My hands shook as I scrolled back through the conversation thread. It went back years. Hundreds of emails. Not just from Mrs. Higgins, but from aunts, uncles, old neighbors, and even strangers connected to church groups and online support networks. The narrative was horrifyingly consistent. I wasn't described as a struggling young adult. I was depicted as a severely mentally ill, volatile, and potentially dangerous individual. My mother detailed private therapy sessions I had attended when I was 18, sessions she had sat in on, twisting my confessions of anxiety into descriptions of manic behavior. She shared stories of me crying in my room as if I were screaming in rage. She attached photos of me when I was at my lowest, unshowered and disheveled, using them as proof of my decline to solicit funds. I clicked open another folder labeled Family Updates. It was a spreadsheet, a literal ledger of her lies. Rows upon rows of names, dates, amounts requested, and amounts received. There were columns for sympathy tactics, where she noted who responded best to stories of my suicidal tendencies versus my aggressive rages. The totals at the bottom of the spreadsheet were staggering. Over the course of 6 years, she had solicited nearly $40,000. And I knew where that money had gone. It hadn't gone to my care. It had gone to new appliances, vacations disguised as retreats for stress, and a brand new car she had bought the previous year, claiming it was a gift from a generous friend. I wasn't a person to her. I was a product she was monetizing. My reputation was the marketing material, and my mental health was the unique selling proposition. When my mother returned from the store, the air in the house had changed. It felt heavy, charged with the static of a coming storm. She bustled into the kitchen, placing grocery bags on the counter with a hum, chatting about the price of milk and the rude cashier. She didn't notice at first that I wasn't responding. She didn't notice the laptop open in front of me, the screen displaying the damning evidence of her betrayal. It wasn't until she turned around, expecting me to help put the vegetables away, that she saw my face. She froze. The smile slid off her face like oil off water, replaced instantly by a mask of defensive panic. She didn't ask what I found. She didn't try to lie or minimize it. She knew I had seen the spreadsheet. She knew I had read the emails. Instead, she switched tactics instantly, her eyes filling with the same crocodile tears she had used to manipulate relatives for years. She started speaking, her voice trembling, telling me that I didn't understand the pressure she was under. She claimed that she did it for me, that the money was for my future, that she was just trying to make sure we were taken care of since my father had left us with nothing. She tried to wrap her arms around me, to physically enforce the dynamic of the comforting mother, but I recoiled as if her touch burned. I stood up, the chair scraping violently against the floor. I didn't shout. The shock was too profound for shouting. I spoke in a monotone, reciting the things I had read, how she had told my uncle I was hallucinating, how she had told Mrs. Higgins I was violent, how she had systematically destroyed my credibility to line her pockets. With every word, her facade crumbled. The desperation on her face shifted to anger. She screamed back at me, abandoning the victim role for the tyrant. She told me that I was ungrateful, that I was indeed difficult, and that she was the only one who could tolerate me. She admitted that maybe she exaggerated a little, but that it didn't matter because the money helped us both. She justified the destruction of my reputation, the alienation of my family, the sabotage of my career, by saying that comfort has a price, and this was just the way the world worked. In that moment, looking at the woman who had nurtured and smothered me in equal measure, I realized the terrifying depth of her narcissism. She hadn't just stolen money, she had stolen my reality. She had rewritten the story of my life to fit a narrative where she was the martyr and I was the monster. She had sold me out, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, all while telling me she loved me. The protection she promised was actually a prison, built from the bricks of her lies and mortared with my own insecurities. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her screaming in the middle of the grocery bags, and went to my room to pack. Leaving was harder than I imagined it would be, Not because I didn't want to go, but because the web my mother had woven was sticky. I had to navigate a world where I was already crazy in the eyes of my family. I knew that if I simply tried to explain myself, they would view it as another manifestation of my instability, just as my mother had conditioned them to. So I had to be smart. I gathered the digital evidence, copying the emails and the spreadsheet to a flash drive. I drafted a final message, not an emotional plea, but a cold, hard packet of truth. I sent it to every single name on that list. Mrs. Higgins, Uncle Jerry, the distant cousins, the church groups. I attached the proof and typed a simple subject line. The truth about Brenda. The fallout was swift and messy. Some family members reached out to apologize, stunned by the depth of the deception. Others refused to believe it. So invested in the narrative were they that they chose to believe I had hacked my mother's account to stage a coup. My mother was furious, unleashing a torrent of phone calls and texts accusing me of betraying her, of turning the family against her. But for the first time in my life, her screams didn't touch me. I blocked her number. I changed the locks on the small apartment I rented with the money I earned from a job I found on my own, without her interference. It has been a year since I walked out of that house. Rebuilding my reputation has been a slow, arduous process. I still feel the sting of the lies she told about me when I run into old acquaintances who look at me with that lingering, confused pity. I know that some people will always believe the version of me my mother sold them. But in exchange for that ruined reputation, I gained something priceless, my freedom. I learned that the person holding the shield isn't always protecting you. Sometimes they're just keeping you in the dark so you can't see them picking your pocket. I am no longer a character in my mother's tragedy. I am Rowan, and for the first time, I am the author of my own story.